I'm Uli Sick. I am involved since 36 years with China, with Chinese contemporary art. I'm a researcher, but I also could collect the results of my research. So I established the largest collection of Chinese contemporary art in the world. I actually have as my ultimate study object China, and I study it through my business activities. I study it through diplomacy as an ambassador, and I study it through the contemporary art. The collection has been built over about 20-some years, and the purpose is to mirror the width and breadth of Chinese contemporary art production. Because at some point I discovered nobody has been collecting Chinese contemporary art, even in a remotely systematic way. And no institution, either in China nor abroad, did collect Chinese contemporary art. So I decided to do what actually a national museum ought to, but did not, to put together a collection that mirrors the art production of China from Cultural Revolution time and the very beginnings of contemporary art up to today. I would best describe the donation I made to the M+ Museum. My collection comprises about 2,300 works by some 400 artists, and I donated 1,500 pieces, plus sold about 50 to the museum. And the selection I made had the purpose that from these works you can understand the storyline of Chinese contemporary art from its very beginnings to today. So whatever you need to understand will be in that exhibition. I have now a different focus than I had until I made the donation. Until then, my ambition was to mirror the whole spectrum of Chinese contemporary art creation. With the donation, that chapter has been closed for me, because now there are institutions, there are many collectors, they can do this, although fragments of this. So I focus much more on a few artists I take a personal interest in, I like very much. Before I collected many works that belong into this document, but do I personally like them? Maybe not so much. So now I can put all these things aside. The best way is to see it. The best way is to step into the exhibitions. Actually, my catalogs from my exhibitions would provide that picture, as from Cultural Revolution time and no-name group, as we call the very beginnings of contemporary art, to today. The catalogs of about 12 different exhibitions, like total overview of Chinese art creation, to maybe deep dives like exhibition about calligraphy, or how contemporary artists see calligraphy, or shanshui, landscape painting, the other pillar of Chinese tradition, how contemporary artists today see their own tradition, to a lot of subjects, maybe Shanghai art or art from Guangdong. I did a lot of very different exhibitions. If one would look at this whole set of catalogs, it would give a good overview. And then, of course, there is a wealth of literature, big books and what have you, that would explain maybe in a more dry manner the history of Chinese contemporary art. In a way, as I said, nobody, particularly no national institution, paid any attention to what the contemporary artists were doing. That seemed very odd to me. The biggest cultural space in the world, yet nobody paying attention to what contemporary Chinese artists contribute to contemporary Chinese culture. And that's why I decided to put together this collection in this irrational way, you may call it, assemble so many works. China, of course, is a big country. I personally decided to make this donation to a museum in Hong Kong, which is also China. I did negotiate with the Beijing, Shanghai Minister of Culture. Personally, I'm a fan of the public museum. I think the public museum represents the real memory. If we talk private museums, you are hostage to the taste of an individual. That taste may be good or not so good. Also, we had this experience in China. We don't know what these patrons of private museums will do over time. Maybe they lose interest in running a museum. Some even went bankrupt. Others lose interest, maybe turn to filmmaking, hang around with other people, not with the contemporary artists. So that's the issue hanging over the private museums. I have some understanding in Asia where we don't have such established cultural structure that sometimes you cannot give to a public museum in China because you don't know what they are going to do. There is censorship, there are other issues. Sometimes work disappear. Also, they may not have the know-how to handle contemporary art. Of course, they are very good with antiques and all this, but contemporary art with all kinds of media, material, large size, require different skills. And they have very limited experience handling this, with the exception of 2-3 large museums. It's a complex question because there have been many exhibitions about Chinese art, most of them done by Western curators. These Western curators, some are very knowledgeable, but many of them, they do a trip to China, they visit 20-30 studios, they select from what they see, although the best works will not be visible, they will have, been gone elsewhere. So I question, a lot of the curators' work about the research they do. Then with the Western curators, you often have a bias. They may choose political works rather than others because, well, they know their public and the public is very interested in these politically charged works. And then other works, maybe more silent, requiring context knowledge about Chinese culture, may not find their way to these exhibitions. So I see quite lopsided exhibitions. And particularly in the early years, say after 2000, we saw a number of poorly curated exhibitions. And then they destroy the image of Chinese contemporary art in a whole cultural space. Like we had some very poor exhibition in France, early 2000. And then the people think, well, if a very established institution, like maybe the Pompidou, shows an exhibition, it must be the best. If this is the best, maybe we don't need it. So these exhibitions can actually be very damaging for the image of Chinese contemporary art and lead to misconceptions about Chinese contemporary art. To understand that phenomenon, maybe we must follow the timeline. Until the year 2000, almost exclusively Western collectors acquired Chinese contemporary art. And you could count the Chinese collectors on the fingers of two hands. So only after the year 2000, for reasons we don't go into, Chinese collectors start to acquire Chinese art. And in the first phase, they totally focus on Chinese contemporary art. They feel not safe in purchasing outside Chinese contemporary art. But after 2010 or so, that picture changed, and those collectors who had so much focus on contemporary started to buy Western or non-Chinese art. And when they did that, and still when they do that, in order to feel safe, in order to have also, say, some investment rationale set for themselves, they stick to the brands, they stick to the famous artists, which I regret very much, because I would much more wish they follow like a European type concept where as a collector you want to collect by difference. You want to show your discoveries, your thinking. You're not going to emulate the mainstream one-to-one. But unfortunately, this is still the practice in China. So very, very few individuals venture outside that very proven concept. Of course, you may argue the Chinese public hasn't seen these mainstream artists yet. So it may make sense to collect Kiefer work. So Kiefer is known in China to the Chinese artists, but they may not have come across a work. So now, they see a work of their idol in a museum. So there is a rationale for some of that collecting, but personally, I don't think it's so exciting if you follow that path. Well, my utopia would be a world where the gatekeepers to the important events of this world, the Biennales, the Documenta, comparable events, are equally, sourced from all parts of the world, not predominantly Western, as they are now, because this leads to a disadvantage of art that is not part of the global mainstream spiced up with a few exotisms that, of course, every curator can do. But I hope the world of art will be looked at, and particularly the balance of power will be distributed in a way that different cultures with a variety of priorities, knowledge, all have a say. That would be my utopia. I guess it's slowly going this way because we see more and more Africans, Asians, etc., coming much closer to the power centers of the world and being elected here and there to an important event. So I think we are getting there, but still the global mainstream, and here we are in Basel, if we look at the galleries, is very much dominated by Western galleries and their picks. And as they become more and more powerful, because the resources for institutions are becoming more scarce, they enforce actually their artists on institutions. And these artists are predominantly Western. I always felt that there must be a collection, of course no collection is complete, who can somehow mirror the development of Chinese contemporary art across all media and along the timeline. And I think my collection can do it better than any other collection. Can I do it perfectly? It cannot, because there's always this missing, that missing. Maybe there's another artist one would like to have included, but it's the best document, as I call it. It's a document to record the development of Chinese contemporary art. I think that's the legacy of the collection.